My name is Daniel, and I've been hunting since I was 14 years old. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, where hunting wasn't a hobby, it was just something you did. My dad hunted, my grandfather hunted, and by the time I was old enough to carry a rifle, I was out there with them every season. By my late 20s, I was going out alone regularly. I knew how to read the land, track movement, and stay quiet for hours. I wasn't someone who got spooked easily in the woods. I need you to understand that before I tell you what happened. This took place during rifle season in November, about 3 years ago. I had permission to hunt a large piece of private land that belonged to a friend of my father's, a retired farmer named Gerald, who owned about 80 acres of thick, mixed forest, about 40 minutes outside of town. I'd hunted that property maybe 6 or 7 times before I knew the layout well. Where the deer trails were, where the good tree stands were positioned, which areas were thick, and which opened up into small clearings. I arrived before sunrise, around 5 in the morning, parked my truck at the gate like always, pulled on my gear in the dark, and walked in with my headlamp, cutting through the trees. The woods were completely silent that morning, not even wind, just my footsteps and my breathing. About halfway to my stand, I got this feeling, that specific, uncomfortable feeling that you're being watched. Not a paranoid thought, more like a physical sensation at the back of your neck. I stopped and stood still for almost a full minute, scanning the tree line with my headlamp. Nothing, just trees. I told myself it was the dark. You spend enough time alone in the woods before sunrise, your brain starts playing games with you. I kept walking. I climbed up into my stand about 20 feet off the ground and settled in to wait for daylight. If you've never hunted, the waiting is most of it. You sit, you watch, you listen. Your eyes adjust. Shapes start separating from the darkness, and slowly the forest becomes visible again. About an hour after sunrise, I was glassing the tree line when something made me stop. There was another tree stand about 60 yards to my northeast, a ladder stand, the cheap aluminum kind you can pick up at any sporting goods store. I had never seen it before. I knew this property. It walked every corner of it, and I was absolutely certain that stand had not been there the last time I hunted this section, which was only 2 weeks prior. I watched it for a while, told myself maybe Gerald had put it up for a grandkid or something. Maybe he'd just missed it before. But then I noticed something else that killed that explanation completely. There was snow on the ground that morning, a light dusting, maybe an inch, and I could see the tracks in the snow around the base of that stand. There were no tracks leading to it from the direction of the gate, no tracks from the trail it walked in on. The only tracks were a single line of footprints that came from deep in the woods, from further back in the property, and went straight to the base of the ladder stand. One set coming in from the trees, stopping at the stand, and nothing coming back out. I watched that stand for almost 2 hours without seeing any movement. Around 10 in the morning, I climbed down to stretch and still hunt a little. I told myself I'd walk past the stand and just take a look, satisfy my curiosity, and move on. When I got there, I looked up. The stand was empty. The seat had a thin, undisturbed layer of snow on it that told me nobody had sat in it recently, but those tracks were still there, coming in from the woods, stopping at the base. I followed them backward, further into the property. About 40 yards in, the tracks stopped at a large oak tree. On the opposite side of that oak, the snow was pressed down in a rough circle, like someone had been standing there for a while, just standing, not moving around, not sitting, standing, facing the direction of my stand. I went back to my truck at noon to eat lunch and warm up. I sat in the cab for a long time, thinking about whether to go back in. I did go back in. I convinced myself it was probably just a trespasser, some kid messing around, or someone who didn't know this was private land. I told myself I'd keep my eyes open, and if anything felt wrong, I'd leave. I was back in my stand by 2 in the afternoon. The rest of the day was quiet. No movement near the other stand, nothing unusual. And then, about 40 minutes before sunset, I heard footsteps in the leaves below me. Slow, deliberate, heavy enough to be a person. I turned carefully in my stand, looking down and behind me, and about 30 yards back in the trees, I saw him, a man, standing completely still between 2 birch trees, watching me. He was wearing a dark green jacket and a wool cap pulled low. His face was partially in shadow, but I could see he had a beard, patchy and overgrown. His skin looked wrong, too pale, like he hadn't been in daylight in a long time. And he was smiling, not a full smile, just the corners of his mouth turned up slightly, like he found something amusing that I wasn't in on. I called out to him, asked if he had permission to be on this property. He didn't answer. We stayed like that for what felt like a full minute. Me up in my stand, looking down at him standing motionless between those two trees with that half smile on his face. Then he turned and walked slowly back into the woods. No rush, no acknowledgement that I'd said anything. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, and then I made the worst decision of the afternoon. I stayed until shooting light was done. When I finally climbed down, the light was mostly gone. I started moving fast toward the gate, headlamp on, rifle in hand. About halfway back, I noticed something tied to a branch at eye level, a strip of orange cloth, like someone had torn a piece from a hunting vest. I stopped, looked around. There was another one, about 15 feet further down the trail, tied to a different branch at almost the exact same height, and another after that. They went on like that, every 12 to 15 feet off to the right side of the trail. Not random, not markers I recognized, something deliberate. I followed them with my eyes but didn't leave the trail. The last one had something hanging from it, a dead squirrel hung by a wire looped through its back legs. Under the squirrel, pressed into the soft earth, someone had drawn a rough circle with the toe of a boot, a complete circle in the dirt, right beneath that hanging animal. I did not stop moving. I turned back toward the gate, and I walked fast. 50 yards from my truck, I saw my backpack leaning against a tree. I had left that backpack up in my stand. It was unzipped, and my things were laid out on the ground in front of it. My knife, my rangefinder, my extra ammunition, arranged in a neat line. Like someone had gone through every pocket and placed each item carefully in order. Someone had been at my stand while I was in it, without me hearing them, without me seeing them. I grabbed my gear and ran. I was 20 feet from my truck when my headlamp swept across the tree line one last time. He was there, standing at the edge of the woods, right at the property line, watching me. And this time he raised one hand slowly, not waving, just one finger, pointing directly at me. Then he dragged that finger slowly across his own throat. I was in my truck and off that property in under 30 seconds. I called Gerald that night and told him everything. 2 weeks later, he called me back and said officers had found a makeshift shelter built into a hillside on the back section of his property. Inside, they found animal bones, stolen gear from neighboring properties, and what looked like a long-term campsite. Whoever it was had been living on that land for weeks. I don't hunt alone anymore, and I will never go back to that property again. Whatever he wanted that afternoon, I don't think it was just to watch. My wife and I are not outdoors people. I need to say that up front, because it's relevant to everything that happened. We are city people. We live in Portland. Our idea of nature is sitting on a patio. So, when we decided to take a long weekend trip through rural Oregon and ended up on a forest road that wasn't on our GPS, what happened next was entirely our own fault. It was October. We'd been driving for about 4 hours, heading toward a small town where we had a reservation at a bed and breakfast. The route we'd chosen took us through some genuinely remote areas, long stretches of highway through dense forest with very few other cars. Around 8 in the evening, I missed a turn. Not a big deal, I thought. I'd just turn around up ahead. But the side road I turned onto kept going, and then narrowed, and then became gravel, and before long, we were about 2 miles into the forest, on a single-lane logging road with trees pressing in on both sides, and no easy place to turn around. My wife asked me to just stop and reverse. I said the road had to open up somewhere ahead. We kept going. It didn't open up. It ended. The road just stopped at a rusted metal gate with a no trespassing sign and the wall of trees beyond it. I put the car in reverse and started backing up, and that's when the engine made a sound I had never heard before. It's hard to describe, a grinding, rhythmic knocking from somewhere under the hood that got louder when I gave it gas, and quieter when I let off. My wife looked at me, and I looked at her, and we both knew this was bad. I pulled over as far as I could to the side of the gravel road and turned off the engine. We had no cell service. We were 2 miles off a highway on a logging road in the middle of a national forest in the dark. Like I said, city people. I popped the hood and stood there looking at the engine with a flashlight, which did absolutely nothing useful because I don't know anything about engines. My wife stayed in the car and started going through her phone to find any downloaded maps. Like I said, city people. I popped the hood and stood there looking at the engine with a flashlight, which did absolutely nothing useful because I don't know anything about engines. My wife stayed in the car and started going through her phone to find any downloaded maps. We'd been stopped for maybe 10 minutes when she knocked on the window and told me to get back in the car. Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that means, don't ask questions right now. I got in. She pointed toward the trees on the passenger side of the road, about 30 feet back from the car. There was a light in the woods, not moving, just sitting there, between the trees, a dull yellow glow like a lantern, too steady to be a flashlight, too dim to be anything mechanical. We sat in the dark, watching it for a few minutes. Neither of us spoke. I told myself it was a house, maybe a cabin set back from the road. Then the light moved, slowly. It came forward about 10 feet, then stopped, then came forward again, like someone was walking toward us, stopping, then walking again. My wife said we should honk the horn and get someone's attention. I said no. I don't know why I said no. It wasn't a rational thought. It was just a feeling, a very clear, immediate feeling that drawing attention to ourselves right then was not what we should do. We sat in silence and watched the light stop moving. It just sat there in the trees, maybe 20 feet from the road now, and held still. After a few minutes, something moved in my peripheral vision on the driver's side. I turned slowly. A man was standing in the road behind our car. He was just standing there in the middle of the gravel road, maybe 30 feet back at the edge of where our taillights reached. His hands were in the pockets of a dark jacket. He wasn't moving, just standing and watching the car. My wife grabbed my arm. I started the car. The grinding sound from the engine was still there, worse now, loud in the silence. But the car moved. I pulled forward, did a 3-point turn in the narrow road with my hands shaking, and drove out of there. The whole time I kept my eyes on the mirrors, watching that man get smaller in the red glow of the taillights until the road curved and he disappeared. We made it back to the highway. The car held together long enough to limp to a gas station 8 miles down the road, where we sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes before either of us really spoke. The mechanic the next morning said a belt had been on the verge of snapping for a while. Another few miles, and the engine would have shut off completely. If that had happened on that logging road, we don't talk about what would have come next. We never found out who the man was, or who was holding the light in the trees. We told ourselves it was just locals, people who lived or worked back there and didn't appreciate strangers on their road at night. I'm still telling myself that. Some explanations are better left unconfirmed. I've had my dog Remy for 9 years. He's a large German Shepherd mix, about 80 pounds, territorial, and not easily rattled. I've camped with him in remote areas dozens of times. He's been around wildlife, other dogs, strange people, loud noises. He doesn't spook easily. That's just who he is. I'm telling you this because what happened in Montana last summer started with Remy acting like a completely different animal, and that scared me before anything else did. Id rented a cabin about 30 minutes outside of a small town in western Montana for a solo trip, just a week alone in the mountains to decompress. I work in a high-pressure job, and once a year I try to completely disconnect. No phone calls, no emails, just me, Remy, and whatever trail we felt like walking that day. The cabin was remote, but not isolated. There was a main road about a half-mile down the hill, and a few other properties in the area, mostly seasonal places. The rental host told me it'd likely have the whole ridge to myself for the week, since it was late in the season. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. Quiet, cold mornings, Clear nights, long walks. Remy was in his element, running ahead on trails, coming back, running ahead again, completely normal. On the third day, that changed. We came back from a morning walk around 11. The second we got within sight of the cabin, Remy stopped. He went completely rigid, every muscle locked. He was staring at the cabin with his ears pinned back flat against his head. The posture he uses when he's identified something as a threat. Not curiosity, not excitement, pure alert. Voice slows down. I stood still beside him and looked at the cabin for a long moment. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Door closed, windows closed, nothing out of place that I could see. But Remy wouldn't move forward. I had to walk ahead of him and coax him to the door. He came, but he stayed pressed against my left leg the entire way, which he never does. When I opened the front door and went inside, he stopped at the threshold and refused to come in for almost 5 minutes. I walked every room in that cabin, checked every closet, every cabinet under both beds, nothing. I checked the outside too, walked the full perimeter of the building, looked at the windows for marks, checked the door for signs of tampering, nothing. Remy eventually came inside, but he spent the rest of that afternoon in the corner of the living room, facing the front door, just watching it. Pace stays calm, but something is wrong. Let the listener feel it. That night, around 2 in the morning, Remy woke me up. He wasn't barking, he was doing something. I'd never heard from him. A low, sustained growl that he was clearly trying to suppress, like he wanted to growl louder, but was holding back. He was standing at the bedroom window, with his nose almost touching the glass. I got out of bed and stood beside him. At first, I saw nothing, just the dark outline of the tree line, about 40 feet from the cabin. The clearing in between, barely visible in the moonlight. Then I saw the shape. Someone was standing at the edge of the trees, completely still, just inside the shadow of the tree line, where the moonlight didn't quite reach. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person standing there, not moving, not coming closer, just there. Voice drops very quiet. I watched for what felt like a very long time. The shape didn't move. I finally stepped back from the window, grabbed my phone, no service, which I already knew, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, trying to decide what to do. When I looked at the window again, Remy had stopped growling. He was still at the window, but his posture had shifted. He was no longer rigid. He was doing that thing dogs do when something confuses them, head tilted slightly, ears forward instead of back, like whatever had been there was gone, and he wasn't sure where it went. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. In the morning, I walked the tree line. There was soft earth near the edge where the undergrowth thinned out, and in that earth, I found boot prints, 2 feet close together, pointed toward the cabin. No prints leading away, short pause, let that land. Just prints arriving, standing, and then nothing. I went back to the cabin, packed everything I needed for one night, and drove to town. I told the rental host what I'd seen. He didn't seem entirely surprised. He said there had been a man, a former ranch hand, who had worked in the area years ago and occasionally came back, had been asked to stay off the properties before. He was, in the host's words, not quite right. He offered to call the sheriff's department to do a check of the property. Dark, quiet, closing M&N style. I told him I appreciated that. I also told him I wouldn't be going back to find out what they found. Some things I've learned are better left to other people to deal with. Remy slept on the bed with me in that motel room that night, something I'd never allowed before. I didn't argue with him. That's going to do it for tonight. If something happened to you, something you can't explain, something that still keeps you up at night, send it to the email in the description. I read everything. Stay aware, stay safe, and whatever you do, don't look back.